Welcome to an episode of Behind the Scenes, a weekly program unveiling the biggest political developments in Somali politics. I'm Sultan Mohammed, your host and producer here on HORUFADHI Media. In this two-part program, we'll be looking at Somaliland's decades-long campaign to not just undermine the Somali government, but also undermine Somali unity, as the Somali separatist leadership in Hargeisa continues to seek secessionism from the rest of the Somali Republic by whatever means necessary. Now, what are some of the methods being utilized by the separatist government? Now, this is a topic on the program today. We hope you find this program very informative. Please like, share, and for similar content, do subscribe to HORUFADHI Media. And last but not least, do follow myself, Sultan Mohammed, Suleiman Hashi, Yasin Abdi, and the wider HORUFADHI Media team on our social media platforms that should appear on the screen any moment. Let's get straight into the news. Since 1991, the Somali National Movement, or the SNM, has been administrating a region in northern Somalia known formally as British Somaliland. The current president of the separatist government in Hargeisa himself is a member of the former SNM militia that fought against the Siad Barre military government between 1988 and 1991. Since then, the so-called Northern Clans Peace Conference that occurred in Bur'o between April 27th and May 18th, 1991, the SNM leadership in the region unilaterally declared itself separate from the rest of the Somali Republic that formed on July 1st, 1960. Now, the SNM leadership have been attempted to convince the world that this unilateral decision that they made in May 1991 to secede from the rest of the Republic was legal. However, the biggest question is, how legal was this unilateral action? Now, under the Act of Union 1960, the newly independent territories of the state of Somaliland and state of Somalia would unite to form the new Somali Republic. Now, before one argues that it proves that these two were two separate states, let's take a look at the historical context to understand. You see, the region of Italian Somaliland was conquered by the British in 1941 following the defeat of Italy during World War II. And the region would remain under British military control until 1950, where the region would become a UN trusteeship under Italian administration for 10 years, up until 1960. Now, the idea of a possible merger of British and Italian Somaliland surfaced as early as 1959 in Britain. In February of that year, the British Colonial Secretary Alan Lennox Boyd proposed while he was in Hargeisa that British Somaliland have the option to choose between early self-government and an early association with Italian Somaliland, which at the time was scheduled to gain independence in December of 1960. By May of 1960, British Colonial Secretary Ian MacLeod officially stated that Britain was about to grant independence to Somaliland Protectorate so that it can unite with Italian Somaliland, which was scheduled to become a sovereign state on July 1st in 1960. And the secretary made his announcement while Somaliland leaders were in London for talks on a constitution. He underlined that the merger between the two Somalilands was in accordance with the wishes of British Somaliland leadership who wanted to join their brothers in Italian Somaliland. Now, in April 1960, the Legislative Council in British Somaliland passed a resolution asking not only for independence, but also to unite with Italian Somaliland. And after having a one-week conference in Mogadishu, the two sides jointly announced that the two Somalilands will unite as a Somali Republic, and the two legislative councils will be merging into one national assembly. On June 26, 1960, the blue and white star flag was hoisted in Hargeisa, the moment the iconic picture of Mohammed Haji Ibrahim Igal standing in front of the Somali flag was taken. Now, interestingly, reading articles at the time written by British newspapers show that the British Somaliland region was intent on forming a country with the Italian Somaliland region, which was gaining independence on Friday, the commencing week, as British Somaliland gained independence on the 26th of June, which was on a Sunday. More interestingly, a delegation from Mogadishu, including Aden Abdullah, who would become the first president of the newly formed Somali Republic, was welcomed in Hargeisa on the 26th of June. Now, Aden Abdullah was met by Prime Minister Igal on his arrival at the airport, and police and Somaliland scouts lined up to give a general salute, and he was greeted by a fanfare of trumpets. These two would become the first president and prime minister of the newly formed Somali Republic only a week later. So now we understand the historical political context behind the Act of Union 1960. Let's take a look at what the Act actually says. So now we understand the historical political context that eventually led to the Act of Union 1960, which was the fact that both regions wanted unification. Let's actually take a look at what the Act actually says. And I'm quoting, Whereas the state of Somaliland achieved independence and ceased to be under British protection or within the jurisdiction and sovereignty of Her Britannic Majesty on the 26th day of June 1960, and whereas the state of Somalia achieved its independence and ceased to have the status of a trust territory of the United Nations Organization administered by the Republic of Italy on the 1st of July 1960, and whereas it is the will of the peoples of Somaliland and Somalia that their states shall unite, forever be united under the Somali Republic, it continues, and I quote, Union 1A, the state of Somaliland and the state of Somalia do hereby unite and shall therefore remain united in a independent, new, democratic, unitary republic, the name whereof shall the Somali Republic. So simply put it, this constitutional law, which was binding at the point in which the S&M group attempted to declare independence in 1991, would nullify the very declaration, rendering it illegal because the secession of the northern regions would require the repealing of the Act of Union 1960 under Somali law. Therefore, one cannot unilaterally trigger secession legally while ignoring the legality under Somali national law. This is the very reason as to why the international community does not currently recognize the secessionist regime in Hargeisa. It simply does not possess the legal underpinnings to seek independence, as it is illegitimate under the very law it seeks to retract from. Now, ever since this illegal and unilateral decision to secede, the S&M leadership has embarked on a quest to not only undermine Somali unity within the nation, but also undermine the Somali government internationally via paid lobbyists and political groups, which will be discussed more on our second part to this program. So, what are some of the other misconstrued facts perpetuated by the Northern Separatists' campaign for a separate state? Number one, the S&M group was fighting the Barre regime because it was seeking independence for the northern regions. Now, this is not quite true. The reality is that the S&M was amongst a number of Somali rebel movements across the country that were opposed to the dictatorial rule of Siad Barre, which by this point was becoming increasingly authoritarian, particularly since the 1977 war. Despite myths, the S&M initially was not created to become a clan-based organization, with many steps taken to actually broaden the movement. In fact, after the collapse of the Barre government in the northern regions, the S&M was one of the first groups to call for Somali unity talks. The secessionist movement within the S&M only began to gain influence in 1991, and only after the USC established a unilateral government in Mogadishu, calling itself the Somali government without any input from the S&M and the northern regions, or sharing any power to form a unified Somali transitional government. Statement number two, the S&M ousted the Barre regime from northern Somalia. Again, while it is true that the militia fought against the Barre forces throughout the majority of its existence since 1981, however, the group remained in exile in the UK and Saudi Arabia. The group played a role in weakening the Somali army in the regions of Togdheer and Waqooyi Galbeed. But the reality is that the Somali army did not capitulate officially or properly until the Barre regime collapsed in January of 1991, which resulted in army personnel abandoning their positions. The reality was that the collapse of the Barre regime in the northern regions was in conjunction and was as a result and as part of the other battles against the Barre government in the rest of Somalia, such as the USC in Mogadishu. Fact statement number three. Northern Isa clan was indiscriminately and disproportionately targeted by the Barre regime. Now, indeed, the Barre regime would utilize clan and tribal tactics to oppress Somali peoples in the country, as its paranoia and obsession with maintaining power grew towards the end of his rule. Of course, the people of the northern regions, and specifically the Isa clan, were brutally oppressed and prosecuted by the Barre regime. I do not take anything away from the despicable atrocities that were committed by some members of the Somali armed forces and the Barre government against the northern regions. However, this was not disproportionately against a particular clan. The Barre regime targeted all forms of dissidents from all other clans equally, including the SSDF, which represented a section of the Darod clan, or the USC, which represented a section of the Hawiye clan. The reality is that the Barre regime targeted all these groups, and as Somali society naturally fragmented itself into clan affiliation, all these groups and the clans they represented were ultimately targeted because the Barre regime was desperate. The simple evidence for this is the fact that the undisputed fact that the majority of suffering that occurred in Waqooyi Galbeed and Togdel regions were between 1988 and 1991, and these were the period in which the SNM was in active conflict with the Barre regime. Between 1981 and 1988, there was a no all-out war in the northern regions. In other words, the SNM was not targeted by the Barre regime because it was a particular clan, but rather it was dissidents, much like the SSDF or the USC. Nevertheless, that does not mean I take away the fact that the Barre regime did not brutalize the local population and fire indiscriminate shelling, as well as commit atrocities against the locals. However, such brutality was witnessed throughout Somalia, and not just during the Barre war, but also after, during the clan conflicts that occurred throughout Somalia towards the mid and late 1990s. So, in conclusion, the reality is that the SNM separatist agenda does not have the legal underpinnings under Somali national law and the Act of Union 1960 to unilaterally withdraw from the Republic. It requires Parliament and a discussion of all political actors in Somalia to discuss any form of separation of the Union, because the Union was formed when all parties that represented the Somali Republic, from Awdal all the way down to the lower Juba, sat together and decided that they would form a country, and therefore those very parties must sit down again and decide whether the Republic should cease to exist. Additionally, many facts have been misconstrued regarding the beginnings, agenda, and the purpose of the SNM group, as well as the Somali Civil War, to push a fairy tale narrative that does not accurately represent the context, both historically and politically, of what was going on, not just in Somalia, but also in neighboring Ethiopia. So, what about today? How does Somaliland separatists, or how did the separatist movement in the self-declared Somaliland region continue to undermine Somali unity while simultaneously pushing the continued agenda of separatism? That will be the topic of the next part to this two-part program.